Have you ever wondered what happened to the prisoners of war who simply vanished into the American heartland during World War II? This is the true story of a German soldier who escaped into the Nebraska cornfields in 1944 and disappeared without a trace. But here's the twist. Decades later, they found him. He wasn't hiding in some remote cabin or living under a bridge. He was living in plain sight, owning the very farm where he once worked as a captive. Summer 1943. The war in Europe raged on, but thousands of miles away in Nebraska, a different kind of battle was taking place. American farms were struggling. With most young men shipped overseas to fight, there simply weren't enough hands to harvest the endless fields of corn, wheat, and sugar beets that fed the nation. The solution came in the form of an unlikely workforce: German prisoners of war. Captured in North Africa and Europe, these enemy soldiers were transported across the Atlantic to rural America, where they would spend the remainder of the war working the land under armed guard. Camp Atlanta, located in south-central Nebraska, was one of dozens of such facilities scattered across the Midwest. Surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, it housed nearly 3,000 German POWs by the summer of 1944. These weren't hardened SS officers or Nazi fanatics. Most were ordinary conscripts, young men who had been swept up in Hitler's war machine and now found themselves an ocean away from home, living in wooden barracks on the Great Plains. Among them was Friedrich Bergmann, a 24-year-old soldier from a small farming village in Bavaria. Fritz, as his friends called him, had been captured near Tunis in May 1943 during the final collapse of the Afrika Korps. After months in a British detention camp in Algeria, he was shipped to New York and then by train to Nebraska. He arrived at Camp Atlanta in August 1943, exhausted, homesick, and uncertain if he would ever see Germany again. But something unexpected happened during Fritz's time in Nebraska. Unlike the brutal conditions he had experienced on the front lines, life as a POW in America was surprisingly tolerable. The Geneva Conventions guaranteed humane treatment, adequate food, and even small wages for work performed. Fritz and his fellow prisoners were assigned to local farms during harvest season, transported each morning in military trucks and returned to camp each evening. They picked corn, hauled beets, and mended fences under the watchful eyes of American guards. What struck Fritz most profoundly was the kindness of the farmers themselves. These were people whose sons and husbands were fighting and dying against Germany, yet they treated their captive laborers with unexpected decency. They shared meals, offered cold water on hot days, and sometimes even attempted broken conversations in German. For Fritz, who had grown up on his father's farm in Bavaria, the work felt familiar, almost comforting. The flat Nebraska landscape reminded him of home, and for brief moments, he could almost forget he was a prisoner. Sergeant Daniel Crawford was the guard assigned to Fritz's work detail. A career military man from Ohio, Crawford had initially viewed his assignment with disdain. Babysitting Nazis wasn't what he had signed up for. But as weeks turned into months, his perspective shifted. He noticed that these Germans weren't monsters. They were tired, scared young men who worked hard, complained little, and seemed genuinely grateful for decent treatment. Crawford found himself relaxing his vigilance, allowing the prisoners small freedoms like resting in the shade or taking longer lunch breaks. It was during one of these work assignments in late August 1944 that Fritz's life would change forever. He and 15 other prisoners had been transported to a large farm about 12 miles from Camp Atlanta. The property belonged to the Thompson family, though only Margaret Thompson and her 8-year-old daughter Emily remained. Margaret's husband had been killed at Guadalcanal 2 years earlier, and she had been struggling to maintain the farm alone. The arrival of POW labor was a godsend, even if it meant having enemy soldiers on her property. Fritz noticed Margaret immediately. She was different from the other farmers' wives, younger and more reserved. She watched the prisoners work from the porch of her farmhouse, her expression unreadable. But Fritz also noticed something else. The farm was falling apart. Fences sagged, equipment sat broken in the yard, and entire sections of fields had gone unplanted. This woman was drowning, trying to hold together something too large for one person to manage. On the third day of work at the Thompson farm, something shifted. Fritz was repairing a fence post when he noticed the water pump near the barn had broken, leaving the livestock without easy access to water. Without asking permission, he spent his lunch break fixing it using wire and scrap metal he found in the barn. When Margaret came out and saw what he had done, She stood silently for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She brought him a plate of food, real food, not the standard prison rations. She set it down without a word and walked away. But Fritz understood. It was acknowledgement. It was gratitude. That small act of kindness planted a seed in Fritz's mind. For months he had accepted his fate as a prisoner, counting the days until the war ended and he could return to Germany. But return to what? His letters home had gone unanswered for nearly a year. He had no way of knowing if his family's farm still stood, if his parents were even alive. Germany was being bombed into rubble. The war was clearly lost. What future awaited him there? Meanwhile, here in Nebraska there was land, opportunity, and people who, despite everything, had shown him compassion. The idea began as a whisper in the back of his mind but grew louder with each passing day. What if he didn't go back? What if he stayed? Escape attempts from POW camps were rare but not unheard of. Most prisoners had no desire to flee. Where would they go? They had no money, no connections, and their German accents made them instantly recognizable. But Fritz had something most escapees didn't: farming skills, knowledge of the land, and a specific destination in mind. He had noticed that the Thompson farm sat at the end of a long dirt road, isolated from neighbors by miles of cornfields. He had observed that Sergeant Crawford often dozed in the truck during afternoon breaks, and he had seen the old storm cellar behind the barn, half hidden by overgrown weeds. Fritz confided his plan to only one person, Heinrich Becker, an older prisoner who had become his closest friend at Camp Atlanta. Henry, as he preferred to be called, was a former schoolteacher from Hamburg, cynical about the war and skeptical of Nazi ideology. When Fritz told him about his intention to escape, Henry didn't try to talk him out of it. Instead, he helped him plan. The escape happened on September 7, 1944, during the afternoon work shift. The prisoners were spread across the Thompson property, harvesting corn under the blazing sun. Sergeant Crawford sat in the shade of his truck reading a newspaper. Fritz had volunteered to work the far eastern section of the field, the area closest to a dense line of trees that marked the property boundary. At precisely 2:30, while the other prisoners created a minor distraction by pretending to discover a broken piece of equipment, Fritz simply walked into the corn and kept walking. He moved quickly but carefully, using the tall stalks as cover. He had studied the landscape during previous workdays and knew that the cornfield extended for nearly 2 miles before reaching a county road. Beyond that lay more farms, more fields, and endless places to hide. He carried nothing except the clothes on his back and a small pocket knife he had traded for weeks earlier. His prison uniform was a liability, but he had a plan for that too. By the time Sergeant Crawford noticed Fritz was missing, nearly 45 minutes had passed. A frantic search began immediately. Guards combed the fields, dogs were brought in, and local law enforcement was notified. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw, a weathered veteran of the First World War, coordinated the manhunt. Roadblocks were set up, neighboring farms were alerted, and search parties worked through the night. But Fritz had vanished. What the searchers didn't know was that Fritz hadn't run far. He had circled back through the cornfields and taken refuge in the very place he had scouted weeks earlier, the old storm cellar behind the Thompson barn. It was a calculated risk. No one would think to search the property where he had escaped from, at least not thoroughly. The cellar was partially collapsed, its wooden doors covered by weeds and debris. Fritz squeezed inside and waited in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the search parties passing overhead. He stayed hidden in that cellar for 3 days, emerging only at night to drink from a nearby creek and forage for food. On the second night, he crept into the barn and found old work clothes hanging on a nail. Civilian clothes that had probably belonged to Margaret's late husband. He stripped off his prison uniform, buried it in the soft earth of the cellar, and dressed in the faded shirt and overalls. With his blonde hair and sun-tanned skin, he could now pass for any other farmhand in Nebraska, as long as no one listened too carefully to his accent. On the 4th night, weak from hunger and knowing he couldn't hide forever, Fritz made a desperate decision. He approached the Thompson farmhouse. It was past midnight, and the house was dark. He knocked softly on the back door, his heart pounding. When Margaret opened the door, lamp in hand, she froze. For a long moment, they stared at each other. She knew exactly who he was. The entire county had been searching for the escaped German prisoner. Margaret should have screamed. She should have run for the sheriff. Instead, she asked a single question in a quiet voice. "Why did you come here?" Fritz's English was limited, but he managed to convey the essential truth. He had nowhere else to go. He meant no harm. He just wanted to work, to live. He gestured toward the broken-down farm around them and offered a bargain. "Let me stay, let me help, and I'll fix everything. I'll work for nothing. Just don't turn me in." It was insane. It was dangerous. It could land Margaret in prison for harboring an enemy fugitive. But as she stood there in her nightgown looking at this young man who had fixed her water pump and now stood trembling on her doorstep, she made a choice that would alter both their lives forever. She let him in. The arrangement began simply. Fritz would hide in the barn during the day and work at night, repairing equipment and maintaining the farm under cover of darkness. Margaret would leave food for him and keep watch for visitors. It was supposed to be temporary, just until the search died down and Fritz could figure out his next move. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. As autumn gave way to winter, the search for the escaped POW gradually lost momentum. Sergeant Crawford faced disciplinary action but kept his rank. Sheriff Bradshaw concluded that the prisoner had likely died of exposure or drowned trying to cross the Platte River. The case remained open but inactive. At Camp Atlanta, Henry Becker told investigators that Fritz had sometimes talked about escaping to Mexico, a lie designed to send searchers in the wrong direction. The trail went cold. Meanwhile, at the Thompson farm, an unlikely partnership was forming. Fritz proved to be as good as his word. Working tirelessly, he repaired machinery that had sat broken for years, mended miles of fence, and prepared fields for spring planting. Margaret, initially wary and guilt-ridden, found herself relying on him more each day. They communicated in a mixture of broken English, hand gestures, and the universal language of farm work. Emily, Margaret's daughter, discovered Fritz in the barn one December morning. Margaret had tried to keep her away, but children are curious. When Emily stumbled upon the strange man sleeping in the hayloft, she wasn't frightened. She was fascinated. Fritz, who had younger siblings back in Germany, won her over quickly with small kindnesses. A carved wooden horse, a funny face, a piggyback ride around the barn. Margaret realized that trying to keep them separated was futile. Instead, she sat Emily down and told her a carefully constructed lie. This was Frank, a distant cousin who had come to help with the farm. He was shy and didn't like visitors, so it was their special secret. Emily, thrilled to be trusted with grown-up information, accepted the story completely. As winter deepened, Fritz moved from the barn into a small room off the kitchen that had once been used for storage. The pretense that he was just temporary help had evaporated. He was living in the house now, eating meals with Margaret and Emily, listening to the radio in the evenings. Margaret told her few neighbors that she had hired a farmhand, a drifter who preferred to keep to himself. In rural Nebraska during wartime, when labor was scarce, no one asked too many questions. The transformation of Fritz into Frank Miller happened gradually. Margaret helped him improve his English, correcting his pronunciation and teaching him American idioms. She burned his German identification papers in the fireplace and helped him construct a new identity. Frank Miller, born in Wisconsin to German immigrant parents, orphaned young, a wanderer who had worked farms across the Midwest. It was a simple story, vague enough to discourage detailed questions but plausible enough to satisfy casual curiosity. By the spring of 1945, Frank had become an established presence in the community. He accompanied Margaret to town occasionally, buying supplies and equipment. He kept his head down, spoke little, and let his work ethic speak for itself. When Germany surrendered in May, Frank listened to the radio broadcast with mixed emotions. The war was over, but his homeland lay in ruins. The reports of devastation, mass displacement, and Soviet occupation convinced him that he had made the right choice. There was nothing to return to. The relationship between Margaret and Fritz, now Frank, evolved slowly. They were two lonely people who had found unexpected companionship in desperate circumstances. Margaret had been a widow for 3 years, isolated by grief and the demands of the farm. Frank was in exile, cut off from everything he had known. They filled empty spaces in each other's lives. Friendship deepened into affection, and affection into something more profound. In the autumn of 1946, they were married by Reverend Arthur Caldwell in a quiet ceremony at the small Lutheran church in town. Emily served as flower girl, delighted that Frank was officially becoming her father. The Reverend, a kind man who administered to German POWs during the war, sensed there was more to Frank's story than met the eye. The accent, the vague past, the timing of his arrival. But Caldwell had seen enough of war's cruelty to know that mercy sometimes required looking the other way. He performed the ceremony and asked no uncomfortable questions. The years that followed were the happiest of Frank's life. The farm prospered under his tireless management. He expanded operations, modernized equipment, and developed a reputation as one of the most skilled farmers in the county. Emily grew from a curious child into a bright teenager who adored her stepfather. Margaret, who had nearly lost everything, found herself secure and content. Frank had nightmares sometimes, waking in a cold sweat from dreams of North Africa or the prison camp, but Margaret would hold him until the trembling stopped. They never spoke of his past. It was a door they had closed and locked, but the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. In the summer of 1952, Heinrich Becker returned to Nebraska. Henry had been repatriated to Germany in late 1945 and had spent years in the rubble of Hamburg trying to rebuild his life, but Germany held too many ghosts. He had lost his wife and daughter in the bombing raids, and the country itself felt alien to him. Using money he had saved and connections he had made, Henry emigrated to the United States in 1951, settling in Omaha, where a small community of German immigrants had established themselves. Henry had never forgotten his friend Fritz. He had kept the secret of the escape, deflecting questions and misdirecting investigators. Now, driven by curiosity and nostalgia, he made the journey south to the area where they had once been imprisoned. Through discreet inquiries, he learned about a farmer named Frank Miller, who had appeared in the area around the time of Fritz's disappearance. When Henry finally saw Frank working in his fields, recognition was instant. Their reunion was emotional and complicated. Frank was terrified that Henry's presence would expose him, but Henry assured him he had no intention of revealing the truth. He was simply happy to see his friend alive and thriving. Over several visits, Frank told Henry the full story of his escape and transformation. Henry, in turn, shared the grim news from Germany. Fritz's family farm had been destroyed in the fighting, his father killed, his mother and siblings scattered as refugees. There truly was nothing left to return to. Henry became a regular visitor to the Thompson farm, accepted by Margaret as Frank's old friend from his time working other farms before arriving in Nebraska. The cover story held. But Henry's presence reminded Frank of the precarious nature of his new life. He was living a lie, and lies, no matter how well constructed, are fragile things. The first crack appeared in 1958. Sheriff Tom Bradshaw, now in his 60s and nearing retirement, was organizing old case files when he came across the file on the escaped German POW from 1944. Something about the timing nagged at him. He pulled out a county census from 1947 and cross-referenced names and arrival dates. Frank Miller had appeared in the area in late 1944, right after the escape. He had married Margaret Thompson, whose farm had been the site of the escape. The coincidence was too precise. Bradshaw drove out to the Thompson farm one autumn afternoon. Frank was in the fields when the sheriff arrived, but he saw the patrol car and felt ice in his veins. Margaret met Bradshaw on the porch, offering coffee with a steady hand despite her racing heart. The sheriff accepted and made small talk for a while before getting to the point. He wanted to speak with Frank. Just a few questions about the old days, nothing serious. When Frank came in from the fields, he found Bradshaw sitting at the kitchen table. The two men looked at each other, and in that moment Frank knew that the sheriff had figured it out. Bradshaw asked casual questions at first. Where exactly in Wisconsin was Frank from? What were his parents' names? Which farms had he worked before coming to Nebraska? Frank answered carefully, sticking to the story he had rehearsed 1,000 times, but he could see the skepticism in Bradshaw's eyes. Finally, Bradshaw set down his coffee cup and spoke plainly. He said he had been a lawman for 30 years and had developed a sense for when something didn't add up. He said he remembered the escaped prisoner from Camp Atlanta and how the man had vanished without a trace. He said it was remarkable how Frank had appeared in the area at exactly that time and had never once left Nebraska since, almost as if he was afraid of encountering authorities outside the county. He said all of this in a calm, measured tone, watching Frank's reaction. Frank sat silently for a long moment. He could deny everything, maintain the fiction, but he was tired of lying. More importantly, he realized that Bradshaw wasn't here to arrest him. If that were the intention, deputies would have accompanied him. This was something else. Frank looked at Margaret, who gave him a small nod, and then he told the truth. Not all of it, not the specific details, but enough. He admitted that Frank Miller wasn't his real name. He admitted that he had come to America during the war under circumstances he couldn't fully explain. He said that he had found a home here, built a life, and hurt no one. He asked what Bradshaw intended to do with this information. The sheriff sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said that he had fought in the First World War, had seen the senseless slaughter and come home wondering what it had all been for. He said he had watched young men, American and German alike, get chewed up by a war machine that didn't care about their individual lives. He said that in his years as sheriff he had learned that justice and the law weren't always the same thing. Then he stood up, thanked Margaret for the coffee, and told Frank to take good care of this farm and this family. He walked out, got in his patrol car, and drove away. He never returned, and he never filed a report. The second close call came in 1963 when the U.S. Army conducted a review of unsolved POW escape cases as part of a historical documentation project. An investigator arrived in the area, asking questions and reviewing old records. Frank kept a low profile for weeks, avoiding town and letting Margaret handle any necessary business. The investigator interviewed several people, including some who remembered the 1944 escape, but the trail had gone cold decades earlier. The investigator eventually moved on to other cases, and the danger passed. Through it all, Emily remained unaware of her stepfather's true identity. She had grown into a woman, married a local boy, and started a family of her own. To her, Frank was simply her father, the man who had raised her, taught her to drive a tractor, and walked her down the aisle at her wedding. Margaret and Frank had decided long ago that some secrets were better left untold. Reverend Arthur Caldwell was less easy to deceive. The Reverend, who had spent considerable time ministering to German POWs during the war, had always suspected Frank's true origins. In 1965, during a private conversation after a church service, Caldwell gently confronted Frank. He said he had known for years, had recognized the signs, the slight accent that never fully disappeared, the careful avoidance of certain topics, the way Frank tensed whenever Germany was mentioned. But like Sheriff Bradshaw, Caldwell had chosen silence. He told Frank that God's grace was large enough to encompass even those who had fled from impossible situations. He offered absolution, not for any crime, but for the burden of secrecy Frank had carried for so long. Frank wept in the small church office, the first time he had cried since arriving in America. The decades rolled on. The 1960s gave way to the 1970s. Camp Atlanta, which had been dismantled shortly after the war, was now just a historical footnote, its location marked by a small plaque and some crumbling concrete foundations. Most of the people who had been involved in the 1944 escape were dead or had moved away. Frank and Margaret grew old together, working the farm with the help of hired hands as their own strength diminished. In 1974, a young journalist from Lincoln named David Morrison was researching a book about POW camps in Nebraska. He interviewed dozens of former guards, local residents, and even a few German veterans who had been held at various camps. During his research, he came across the unsolved case of Friedrich Bergmann, the prisoner who had escaped from a work detail near Camp Atlanta and never been found. Morrison became fascinated by the mystery and decided to investigate further. He traveled to the area and began asking questions. Several elderly residents remembered the incident, though details were hazy after 30 years. Morrison obtained old records, maps, and photographs. He plotted the location of the escape and the surrounding farms. One name kept appearing in his research: the Thompson farm, now owned by Frank and Margaret Miller. Morrison decided to interview them for his book, thinking they might have interesting perspectives as residents of the area during the war. When Morrison arrived at the farm in October 1974, he found an elderly but still vigorous man working on a tractor in the yard. Frank, now 74 years old, greeted the journalist cordially, but with obvious wariness. Margaret, suffering from arthritis but still sharp-minded, invited Morrison inside for coffee. The journalist explained his project and asked if they remembered the escaped prisoner from 1944. Frank and Margaret exchanged glances. They had lived with this secret for 30 years, had built an entire life on a foundation of carefully maintained fiction. But they were old now. and the world had changed. The war was ancient history. Most of the people who might have cared were gone, and Frank was tired, so very tired of hiding. What happened next would become the centerpiece of Morrison's book. Frank told his story, the whole truth, on the record. He explained who he really was, how he had escaped, how Margaret had sheltered him, and how he had lived as Frank Miller for 3 decades. Margaret corroborated every detail. Morrison, stunned by the revelation, asked if they were afraid of legal consequences. Frank shrugged and said that he had stopped being afraid years ago. Whatever happened now, he had lived a good life, had been a good husband and father, and had harmed no one. Morrison's book, published in 1976, created a brief sensation. The story of the German POW who became an American farmer captured national attention. There were calls for investigation, debates about justice and statute of limitations, and discussions about the treatment of POWs during the war, but ultimately, no charges were ever filed. The U.S. Attorney's Office determined that prosecuting a 76-year-old man for escaping from a POW camp 3 decades earlier served no public interest. Frank Miller, born Friedrich Bergmann, was allowed to live out his remaining years in peace. Emily, who learned the truth from the book like everyone else, was shocked but ultimately accepting. She visited her parents and told Frank that it didn't matter where he had come from or what name he had been born with. He was her father, and that was the only truth that mattered to her. Frank died in 1982 at the age of 82, having lived longer as Frank Miller than he had as Friedrich Bergmann. Margaret followed him 2 years later. They were buried side by side in the Lutheran cemetery, their shared headstone reading simply, Frank and Margaret Miller, together forever. The farm was inherited by Emily's son, Frank's grandson, who continues to work the land to this day. The story raises profound questions about identity, belonging, and the nature of justice. Was Frank a criminal who evaded capture, or a refugee who seized an opportunity for a better life? Was Margaret a lawbreaker who harbored a fugitive, or a compassionate woman who offered sanctuary to someone in need? These questions don't have easy answers, and perhaps that's the point. What we know for certain is this. A young German soldier, far from home and facing an uncertain future, made a desperate choice in a Nebraska cornfield in 1944. That choice led him not to freedom in the abstract sense, but to a different kind of captivity, the constant vigilance required to maintain a false identity. Yet within that captivity, he found something precious: love, family, purpose, and a place to call home. He became American not through paperwork or legal process, but through the daily act of living, working, and contributing to his community. In the end, the man who had been Friedrich Bergmann disappeared completely, not because he was caught or died, but because he genuinely became Frank Miller. The Nebraska cornfields that once hid a frightened fugitive eventually yielded to his plow, producing decades of harvests. The land that had been his temporary prison became his permanent home, and the woman who should have been his captor became his partner in building a life that, despite its foundation of secrecy, was as real and valuable as any other. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories from history. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and let us know in the comments. Do you think Frank made the right choice? What would you have done in his situation? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.